My sister threw my baby on the floor. That left his head bleeding, giving him concussion. AITA for kicking her out? I am absolutely furious as I write this out. It seems so painfully obvious, but literally everyone keeps telling me that I'm in the wrong, and I feel like I might lose my mind. I'm putting this down because I need an external perspective, because I'm honestly starting to lose it. For some background, my 34 younger sister, 19, has been living with us while attending college since we live close by. We've been covering all her expenses because my husband and I have more stable jobs than either of my parents, and we've saved enough money that it makes more sense for us to support her rather than having my parents do it, who, by the way, helped fund both me and my husband's education when we were in school. In exchange for us not charging her any rent, feeding her, and covering her tuition, all I occasionally ask of her is to help me out with my 22-month-old son. It's never for more than an hour max, and it's mostly so I can cook or clean without him trying to cling to my leg or beg for attention. He loves her, so it's much easier to pass him off to her while I try to get things done. She doesn't mind because I usually pay her around $10 to $15 if she watches him for longer than 15 minutes. Please understand, this is never more than an hour. I know she's busy with her studies and often doesn't want to deal with him, but I always ask if she's okay with it. And when she says she's too busy or just not in the mood, I completely respect that and figure out another way to handle him, like letting him watch some YouTube videos. It's not ideal, but it's better than him crawling under my feet when I'm trying to cook or manage something hot. One thing I've warned her about over and over is not to wear necklaces, bracelets, earrings, or hair clips while she's watching him. Anything that he can pull or grab because he loves to yank on them, which is obviously painful. My husband and I have both tried to teach him not to do it, but being a toddler, it's not easy. He either doesn't understand or finds it funny when we tell him no, and punishments rarely seem to work. We won't spank him, but it's hard to discipline a toddler who just laughs when we try to take things away. 2 days ago, I had to run an errand, and it seemed too much trouble to wake my son up from his nap. I asked her if she could watch him for a bit, and she said yes. I told her it would only take 20 minutes at most. She assured me everything would be fine. Before I left, I noticed she was wearing one of those thin plastic headbands. I warned her that it could be dangerous because of how fragile it was, but she told me she'd take it off if he woke up and keep it out of his reach. When I came back, I heard them both screaming, and my son was crying uncontrollably. I saw my sister holding her ear, yelling at him, while he was lying on the floor, crying. I was livid. I grabbed him and saw that his head was bleeding. I immediately panicked, called 911, and waited for the ambulance to arrive. Once the paramedics showed up and I took a closer look at my sister, I realized she had blood on her ear as well. Both of them were taken to the hospital. It turns out that when my son woke up, the two of them were sitting together on the couch. She got distracted by her phone, and when she looked away, my son grabbed her headband and poked it into her ear. In a panic, she threw him to the floor to get him off her, which caused him to fall hard. I was still beyond angry at her for obvious reasons. Thankfully, the bleeding from my son's head wasn't serious, but the doctor said he has a concussion from the fall. Unfortunately, the headband hurt my sister's eardrum, and now her hearing is damaged. I'm sure I'll feel worse about it when the anger subsides, but for now, I'm furious. We've paid for all her medical expenses, of course. Naturally, my husband and I told her she needed to move out and that we wouldn't be covering her tuition past this semester, though we won't be pursuing legal action, as the paramedics suggested we could. The issue is now that some family members are saying we're being too harsh. My parents are insisting we should forgive her since it was an accident, and that I shouldn't have trusted her with my son in the first place. But if she didn't want to babysit, she could have said so. She's a grown adult, not an irresponsible teenager, and should know how to stop a toddler from grabbing things they shouldn't. I honestly don't think I'm the bad guy here, but everyone around me seems to think I'm being unreasonable for expecting her to do the basic job of keeping my son safe when I ask. Edit to add, we had only planned to cover her education for 2 years, like my parents did for me. Paying for all 5 years is simply not possible for us. As for food, I usually cook in large batches, so it's not a huge burden for her to eat with us too. Rent isn't an issue since we have a guest room, and as long as she cleans up after herself, there's no problem. I only paid her when she watched my son for longer than 15 minutes, because I know her classes are demanding. I sympathized with her, so I offered her $15 for helping out while I did household chores. These are things I wouldn't have done otherwise. Second edit. To answer some common questions. Yes, I do discipline my son. When he does something he shouldn't, we try to redirect his behavior, scold him, and explain what he did wrong. We take away things he's throwing, but that's about all we can do without spanking, which neither me nor my husband would ever allow. The doctors say my sister's eardrum will heal in 2 to 3 months, and my son should recover in about 4 weeks. I still haven't spoken to her since I told her to move out. According to my parents, though, she's been deeply remorseful about the whole incident and feels terrible for what happened. I'm still too angry to talk to her, so a meeting probably won't happen anytime soon. I destroyed the guy who slept with my wife. Back in the early 2000s, I started having suspicions about my wife. Our 2 kids, ages 4 and 6 at the time, were old enough to talk about their day, and I started noticing a pattern. They began talking about spending a lot of time at my wife's parents' house during the week. It wasn't all that odd, considering they lived about 90 minutes away, but it seemed excessive. She was going there 2 to 3 times a week, practically on every day she wasn't working her part-time job. I asked her about it, but she denied it, though I could tell she wasn't convincing. So I decided to keep track of the mileage on her car, and sure enough, she was putting in an extra 400 miles or so a week. That confirmed my suspicion. Something was off. Then, one day, I was sitting at the computer, and she had left a sticky note with her AOL password on it. I couldn't resist. I logged in and checked her emails. What I found was a conversation between her and her college BFF, where they casually discussed how my wife had been sleeping with one of her ex-boyfriends from high school. There wasn't much detail, just some mocking about how his wife had gotten fat after having kids. I printed those emails and hid them away. I still needed to know more, so I called a friend of mine who was a cop, and he recommended a private investigator named Ron, who had left the force. I hired him, paid his retainer, and gave him everything I had, including the emails and the details I knew. Ron's investigation was thorough. His report, complete with dates, times, photos, and locations, revealed that my wife would take the kids to her parents' house, then meet this guy for lunch, before heading to a rundown motel for a few hours. Afterward, she would pick up the kids and return home, pretending like everything was normal. I was done. I hired a divorce lawyer. My parents' infidelity had ruined my childhood, and I refused to let the same happen to my kids. I also had Ron dig into the guy's background. He found out his name, Bob, and that he was married with 3 kids. He worked as a vice president of sales at his father-in-law's company. Interesting. So, I had my lawyer prepare the divorce papers. I also asked Ron to get me a couple more copies of his report and do one last thing for me. The same day my wife was served with divorce papers at her job, Ron met with Bob's wife and showed her everything he had uncovered. She deserved to know what her husband had been doing. How she chose to use that information was entirely up to her. While the infidelity didn't directly affect my divorce, Bob's life fell apart after his wife found out. According to public court records, she drained their joint account, took the kids, and left him. When her father found out, Bob was fired from his job. To make matters worse, since her parents owned the house where Bob and his wife had been living, he was also evicted. Their divorce was messy, tons of fighting, both in and out of court. Bob even went to the house to confront his wife, but the situation escalated. Her brother stepped in, and Bob ended up with a broken nose. There were restraining orders, more police involvement, criminal charges, and even jail time. I haven't heard from Bob in a long time. I tried searching for him online, but it seems like he vanished. Last I heard, he moved out of state. As for his ex-wife, she did fine. She started working at her father's business and eventually took over when he retired. As for me, my ex and I had a decent enough relationship after the divorce, but it was strictly about the kids. Now that they're both adults, I don't talk to her at all. I don't hate her. But my only concern is that she's my kid's mom, and that's the only connection we have left.